The marble floors of the Lycan king's palace were always cold, even in summer. I learned that my first week here when I scrubbed them on my hands and knees until my fingers went numb. The other servants said I should be grateful, that an Omega like me, with no pack and no family name, was lucky to even be allowed within these walls. They said it with pity in their eyes, the kind that makes you feel smaller than you already are. I kept my head down. I always kept my head down. The palace was preparing for the summer gathering, when alphas from every territory would come to renew their oaths of loyalty. The air thrummed with tension and excitement, but for those of us who served, it only meant longer hours and harsher scrutiny. The head housekeeper, Madame Corvin, had eyes like a hawk, and a voice that could strip paint from walls. She assigned me to the East Wing, the servants' quarters, the storage rooms, the places where no one important would ever see me. I preferred it that way. The East Wing suited me perfectly. I could lose myself in the repetitive motions of cleaning, polishing, organizing. The other servants largely ignored me, which was a mercy. I'd learned long ago that being invisible was safer than being seen. When you're an Omega without a pack, you're nothing more than a target for cruelty, for exploitation, for the casual violence that those with power inflict on those without. My roommate in the servants' dormitory was a beta named Iris, a kind girl with freckles and red hair who worked in the palace kitchens. She tried to befriend me in those early weeks, sharing bread from the ovens and asking gentle questions about where I came from. I gave her half-truths and deflections, never the full story. Never the part about waking up in an alley with no memory of how I got there, about the scars on my ribs that ached when it rained, about the nightmares that made me wake up screaming until I learned to scream silently, swallowing the sound. Some stories are too heavy to share, some wounds too deep to show, but everything changed the morning Madame Corvin called me into her office, her face pinched with something between annoyance and calculation. The office smelled of lavender and old paper, and the narrow window behind her desk framed the palace gardens in neat geometric precision. She didn't invite me to sit. "The king's personal attendant has taken ill," she said, not looking at me as she sorted through papers with sharp, efficient movements. "You'll attend to his chambers until she recovers." My heart dropped into my stomach. "Madame, I'm not trained for—" "You can clean, can't you? You can fetch water and change linens?" Her eyes finally met mine, sharp and cold as January frost. "Or perhaps you'd prefer to return to wherever you came from, the streets." She meant the streets, where I'd slept in doorways and eaten from trash bins until a traveling merchant took pity and recommended me for palace work, where winter meant choosing between freezing and stealing, where being an Omega alone meant being prey. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "No, madame. I'll do my best. See that you do. The king values his privacy above all else. You are to be invisible, silent, and efficient. Touch nothing that isn't your direct responsibility. Speak only if spoken to." She handed me a ring of keys that felt impossibly heavy in my palm, each one labeled in precise script. "He sleeps late after council meetings. You'll enter at dawn to tend the fire and prepare his morning tea. Is that clear?" "Yes, madame." She dismissed me with a wave of her hand, already focused on the next task, the next problem to solve. I stood in the hallway outside her office for a long moment, staring at the keys in my hand and trying to breathe through the panic rising in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my narrow cot in the servants' dormitory, listening to the other girls breathe in the darkness, and tried not to think about what dawn would bring. Iris had wished me luck before bed. Her expression worried. "Elena's been his attendant for 3 years," she'd whispered. "He trusts her. Just be careful, Sarah. The king isn't cruel, but he's not warm either. And the nobles who visit, some of them look at servants like we're nothing." I'd nodded, unable to find words to reassure her when I couldn't reassure myself. I'd seen King Declan from a distance during ceremonies, a towering figure with dark hair and eyes like winter storms, radiating the kind of power that made even alphas lower their gazes. He moved through the palace like a force of nature, commanding and remote, surrounded always by advisors and guards, and the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders. They said he was ruthless in battle, that he'd united the territories through both diplomacy and bloodshed, that he'd lost his mate years ago and never recovered from the grief. They said a lot of things. Most of them sounded like warnings. When the first gray light crept through the narrow windows, I rose and braided my pale blonde hair into a tight plait, pinned it twice to ensure not a single strand would fall loose, and donned my cleanest uniform. My hands shook as I gathered supplies: a water pitcher, fresh towels, kindling for the fire, the tea service. I moved through the pre-dawn palace like a ghost, my footsteps silent on the cold stone floors. The palace was still quiet as I climbed the grand staircase to the 3rd floor, where the royal chambers occupied the entire southern wing. Tapestries lined the walls here, depicting the history of the Lycan territories, ancient battles, coronations, the Great Unification. I tried not to look at them, tried not to think about the weight of history I was walking into. The guards at the king's door looked at me like I was a ghost, or perhaps a mistake someone had made. One of them, a grizzled beta with scars crossing his face and silver threading through his dark hair, frowned. "You're the new girl? Just until Elena recovers, sir." My voice came out smaller than I intended. He grunted and exchanged a look with his partner, a younger alpha with suspicious eyes. "Remember, silence. The king doesn't tolerate disturbances." The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, and I stepped into a world that made my breath catch. The king's chambers were vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the palace gardens and the forest beyond. The early morning light painted everything in shades of gold and amber, making the room feel like something from a dream. Thick carpets in deep burgundy muffled my footsteps. The furniture was dark wood and deep leather, masculine and imposing, but there were touches of softness too. A worn book left open on a side table, its pages marked with what looked like handwritten notes. A blanket draped over a chair, as if someone had been reading by the fire. A small painting of a meadow in spring, the only piece of art in the entire room, hung where someone lying in bed would see it first thing upon waking. And in the center of it all, in a massive 4-poster bed carved with wolves and moons and ancient symbols I didn't recognize, the king lay sleeping. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might wake him. I'd been told he slept late, but I hadn't expected to see him like this. His dark hair tousled against white pillows, his features relaxed in a way that made him look younger, almost vulnerable. The harsh lines of command and authority were smoothed away in sleep, revealing something gentler beneath. The covers were pushed down to his waist, revealing the kind of physique that came from years of combat training. Broad shoulders, defined muscles, old scars that spoke of battles survived. Even in sleep, he radiated power. But it was different somehow. Quieter, more human. I forced myself to move, silent, invisible, efficient. I crept to the fireplace and knelt, carefully arranging kindling and logs with the precision Elena's notes had stressed was essential. Every small sound felt magnified. The whisper of my skirt against the floor, the soft clink of the poker against the grate, the crackle as flames caught and spread, consuming the dry wood with hungry efficiency. The fire cast dancing shadows across the room, bringing warmth to the cool morning air. I worked with practiced precision, then moved to the windows to draw back the heavy curtains just enough to let in light without flooding the room with brightness. Next, the tea service. I'd memorized his preferences from Elena's notes. Black tea, no sugar, a hint of bergamot, steeped for exactly 3 minutes, served at a temperature just shy of scalding. I prepared it in the small adjoining kitchen, my movements careful and measured, counting the seconds in my head. When I returned to set the tray on the bedside table, I allowed myself one quick glance at his face. His eyes were closed, his breathing deep and even, still asleep. I turned to go, my task complete, when I heard it. A sound so soft I almost missed it, a whimper, caught in the back of his throat. His brow furrowed, his hand clenching the sheets with sudden intensity. Another sound escaped him, this one edged with pain that made something in my chest twist. A nightmare. I froze, torn between my orders to remain invisible and something deeper, something that made my chest ache with recognition. I'd had nightmares too, every night for years after everything. I knew that sound. I knew the weight of it, the way it crushed you from the inside. The feeling of drowning in darkness with no one to pull you out. Madame Corvin's voice echoed in my head. Touch nothing that isn't your direct responsibility. But he made that sound again, and I couldn't bear it. No one should have to suffer alone in the dark. Not even a king. especially not a king who spent his days being strong for everyone else. I moved without thinking, my hand reaching out to gently touch his shoulder. Just a light touch, barely there. The way I wish someone had touched me when I'd wake up screaming, "Your Majesty," I whispered, my voice softer than breath. "You're safe. It's just a dream." His eyes snapped open. I jerked back, terror flooding through me as those storm-gray eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that stole my breath. For a moment, neither of us moved. I could see my death in his gaze. I'd broken every rule, touched the king without permission, woken him from sleep. Madame Corvin would have me thrown out, or worse. But then something strange happened. His expression shifted, the hardness melting into something I couldn't quite name. Confusion, perhaps, or recognition of something he'd expected but hadn't believed he'd find. I apologize, Your Majesty," I stammered, backing toward the door, my voice breaking with fear. "I shouldn't have. You seemed distressed and I only wanted—" "I'll go. I'm so sorry." "Wait." The single word stopped me like a physical force. Not loud, not angry, just tired. Human. I waited, trembling, my eyes fixed on the floor, watching the pattern of the carpet blur as tears threatened to spill. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep and something else. Surprise, maybe. "Sarah, Your Majesty." A long silence stretched between us, heavy with meaning I couldn't decipher. Then, "Why did you do that, Sarah?" I risked a glance up. He was sitting now, the blankets pooled around his waist, studying me with an intensity that made me want to disappear into the floor. But there was no anger in his face. Only curiosity, and beneath it, something that looked almost like loneliness. The kind that comes from being surrounded by people who fear you too much to see you. The truth stuck in my throat, dangerous and raw. "I know what nightmares feel like, Your Majesty. I didn't want you to suffer through it alone." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, maybe, or disbelief that anyone would care about his suffering, that anyone would dare. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, there was a sharp knock at the door that shattered the moment like glass. "Your Majesty, the council awaits your presence." A voice called through the heavy wood, official and impatient. The king's jaw tightened, and just like that, the vulnerable man from moments ago vanished, replaced by the cold monarch the world knew. The transformation was like watching a mask slide into place, perfectly fitted and impenetrable. "I'll be down shortly," he called back, his tone dismissive and commanding. Then his eyes found mine again, and I saw something there that made my breath catch. A question, or perhaps a decision being made in real time. "You may go, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice softer than it had been a moment before. "Same time tomorrow." I curtsied clumsily, nearly dropping the empty tea tray, and fled from the room, my heart racing, my mind spinning with what had just happened. I'd expected anger, punishment, dismissal. Instead, he'd asked my name. He'd asked me to return. I didn't understand it then, couldn't have known that in that single moment of compassion, I'd done something no one else in the palace had dared to do in years. I'd reminded the Lycan king that he was still human, and that, I would soon learn, changed everything. The next morning, I arrived at the king's chambers with my heart in my throat and my hands steadier than they had any right to be. The same guard stood at the door, but this time the scarred beta nodded at me, not friendly, but acknowledging, as if I'd passed some test I hadn't known I was taking. Inside, the room was dim, the curtains still drawn. The fire had burned down to embers during the night, and the air held a chill that made me shiver. I moved quietly to the hearth, rebuilding the fire with practiced efficiency. But my awareness was entirely focused on the bed, on the figure still sleeping there, or pretending to sleep. I couldn't say how I knew, but something felt different. The quality of his stillness, perhaps. The way his breathing seemed almost too measured, too perfect. I completed my tasks, stoking the fire, opening the curtains just enough, preparing his tea, all while that awareness prickled along my spine. When I approached the bedside table to set down the tray, I saw his hand resting on top of the covers, fingers slightly curled. There was a scar across his knuckles, old and white against his tan skin. Another scar ran along his forearm, disappearing beneath the sleeve of his nightshirt. So many scars, so many battles. I set the tray down silently and turned to leave, but something made me pause. A memory of his nightmare, the sound of pain he'd made. Before I could think better of it, I whispered into the quiet room. "I hope you sleep peacefully today, Your Majesty." His eyes remained closed, but I could have sworn I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. I left quickly, my cheeks burning, wondering if I'd imagined it. The pattern continued for 3 days. Each morning I entered his chambers, completed my tasks, and left without incident. He never woke, or never appeared to wake, but on the 4th morning, something changed. I arrived to find him sitting up in bed, clearly awake, reading a document with a frown. My step faltered at the threshold. "Come in, Sarah," he said without looking up. "The fire won't light itself." I obeyed, moving even more carefully than usual, hyper-aware of his presence. As I knelt by the hearth, I could feel his eyes on me, assessing. The silence stretched taut between us. "You're different from Elena," he said finally. My hands stilled on the kindling. "I apologize if my service is inadequate, Your Majesty." That's not what I said. There was something in his tone I couldn't identify. Amusement, maybe, or curiosity. Elena is efficient and professional, but she's also terrified of me. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I focused on arranging the logs, striking the flint to coax sparks from the tinder. "You're not," he continued. "Terrified, I mean. You're nervous, yes, but not afraid. Why is that?" The fire caught, flames licking up the sides of the wood. I watched them dance, buying myself time to think. "I've known worse things than powerful men, Your Majesty," I said finally, surprised by my own honesty. The silence that followed felt weighted. When I finally stood and turned to prepare his tea, I found him watching me with an expression I couldn't read. "Worse things," he repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose you have." Something in his voice made me look up, and for just a moment I saw past the crown and the title to the person underneath, someone who understood what it meant to carry scars no one else could see. The moment shattered when the door burst open and a man strode in without knocking, a tall alpha with golden hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty in his smile. He wore the insignia of the Northern Territories, and moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "Declan, we need to discuss the border." He stopped mid-sentence when he saw me, his eyes raking over my form with an assessment that made my skin crawl. "Well, Elena's been replaced, I see, and with a pretty little Omega, no less." I kept my eyes down, but I could feel the temperature in the room drop. "Lord Garrett," the king said, his voice cold as winter stone. "I don't recall inviting you into my private chambers." Garrett laughed, seemingly unbothered. "Come now, we've known each other since we were boys. Surely I don't need an invitation." His attention returned to me, predatory and sharp. "What's your name, little Omega?" Before I could respond, the king stood from the bed in one fluid motion. He was dressed only in sleep pants and a loose shirt, but the power radiating from him made Garrett take an involuntary step back. "Her name is none of your concern," Declan said quietly. "Sarah, you may go. I'll ring if I need anything else." I curtsied and fled, but not before I heard Garrett's mocking voice. "Protective of the help now, are we? That's new. Or perhaps not just protective. Perhaps our grieving king has finally found something to ease his loneliness." I didn't hear the king's response, but the spike of fury in the air followed me down the hallway. The incident with Lord Garrett changed something. Over the next week, I noticed guards positioned outside the king's chambers earlier than usual. Madame Corvin summoned me twice to emphasize the importance of discretion, her eyes sharp with warning, and the king himself became more present during my morning visits. Not sleeping, but working at his desk, reading, or simply sitting by the fire. We rarely spoke, but the silence between us felt less empty with each passing day. Then came the morning everything shifted. I entered his chambers to find them in disarray, papers scattered across the floor, a chair overturned, and the king standing by the window with his back to me, his shoulders rigid with tension. Even from across the room, I could sense the rage rolling off him in waves. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to back away quietly and return later. but something stopped me. Maybe the set of his shoulders, or the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides, or simply the memory of his nightmare and my own understanding of suffering. "Your Majesty," I ventured softly, "is there anything I can do?" "Leave." The word was barely controlled, rough with fury. I should have obeyed. Instead, I set down my supplies and began quietly picking up the scattered papers, organizing them into neat stacks on his desk. I moved around the overturned chair, righted it carefully. Then I went to the fireplace and began building the morning fire, the familiar routine grounding me even as my heart raced. I said leave. His voice was louder now, and when I glanced back, he'd turned to face me, his eyes blazing. "Are you deaf, Omega?" I met his gaze steadily, recognizing the pain beneath the anger. I'd worn that same mask before, rage as armor, fury to hide the hurt. "I heard you, Your Majesty, but I don't think you really want to be alone right now." For a moment, I thought I'd gone too far. His jaw clenched, and the air seemed to crackle with barely restrained power. An alpha's rage was a dangerous thing, and a king's rage even more so. But then something broke in his expression. The anger drained away, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. He sank into the chair by the window, his head in his hands, looking suddenly less like a king and more like a man drowning under the weight of his responsibilities. I finished lighting the fire and prepared his tea in silence. When I brought it to him, I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. Not with fury anymore, but with something deeper, grief, maybe, or despair. "The Northern Council wants to reinstate the old laws," he said quietly, not looking at me. "The ones that treat Omegas as property. They're pushing for a vote at the summer gathering." My blood ran cold. Those laws had been abolished decades ago, part of the Great Reformation that had united the territories. To bring them back. "Lord Garrett is leading the campaign," he continued, his voice bitter. "He has support from 3 of the 5 territorial alphas. If it goes to a vote, it will pass." He finally looked up at me, and the anguish in his eyes made my chest tighten. "I'm the king, but I cannot rule by decree alone. The territories have autonomy, and there are so many Omegas in the kingdom. Thousands who would lose their freedom, their rights, their safety." I understood then. The papers on the floor were proposals, petitions, legal arguments. He'd been fighting this battle all night, searching for a solution that didn't exist. "You'll find a way," I said softly, believing it even as I said it. "You united the territories once. You can do it again." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You have remarkable faith in someone you barely know. I know enough." I knelt beside his chair, a breach of protocol that would have horrified Madame Corvin. "I know you have nightmares about the people you couldn't save. I know you work through the night searching for solutions. I know you sent Lord Garrett away when he looked at me like I was less than human." I paused, gathering courage. "I know you're a good king, even when being good means carrying an impossible weight." He stared at me, something raw and vulnerable in his expression. "How can you possibly know that?" "Because bad kings don't have nightmares," I said simply. "They sleep peacefully while others suffer." The silence that followed felt sacred somehow, like we'd crossed into territory neither of us had planned to explore. His hand moved, hovering near my face as if he wanted to touch me but couldn't quite allow himself the comfort. "What happened to you, Sarah?" he asked quietly. "What worse things have you known?" I should have deflected, changed the subject, maintained the distance between servant and king. But something about this moment, the morning light, the crackle of the fire, the shared understanding of pain, made me want to be honest. "I don't remember all of it," I admitted. "I woke up in an alley 2 years ago with no memory of how I got there. I had scars I couldn't explain, and nightmares about things I couldn't recall. No pack, no family, no name except the one I gave myself. I looked up at him, but I survived. And then I found my way here, and I've learned that surviving is its own kind of strength." His hand finally made contact, his fingers gentle against my cheek. The touch sent warmth flooding through me. Not just physical heat, but something deeper. Recognition. Connection. The sense of being seen by someone who understood. "You're stronger than you know," he murmured. "So are you," I whispered back. The moment broke when footsteps sounded in the hallway. Sharp, purposeful, approaching rapidly. Declan pulled back, the mask of kingship sliding into place once more, and I stood quickly, smoothing my uniform. A sharp knock. "Your Majesty, the morning council awaits." "I'll be down shortly," he called, his voice steady and commanding once more, but before I could leave, he caught my hand. Just for a second. Just long enough for his thumb to brush across my knuckles in what might have been gratitude or promise or both. "Thank you, Sarah," he said quietly, "for seeing me." I curtsied and left, my heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. As I descended the stairs, I realized that something fundamental had shifted between us. We'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, acknowledged a connection that couldn't be denied. And in the palace halls below, I could already hear the whispers beginning. Rumors about the king and his new attendant. Speculation about what went on behind closed doors. Jealousy and interest and danger woven together. The summer gathering was only 2 weeks away. Everything was about to change. The palace transformed over the following days as preparations for the summer gathering intensified. Banners bearing the sigils of all 5 territories were hung from the rafters of the great hall. Servants polished silver until it gleamed, arranged flowers in massive urns, and prepared guest chambers for the visiting alphas and their entourages. The air hummed with anticipation and underlying tension. Everyone knew this gathering would be different, that the vote on the Omega laws would shake the foundation of everything the kingdom had built. I kept my head down and my duties focused, but it was impossible to ignore the way eyes followed me now. Word had spread somehow, perhaps through the guards, perhaps through Lord Garrett's malicious tongue, that I was more than just a temporary replacement for Elena. The other servants whispered when I passed. Some looked at me with envy, others with pity, and a few with outright hostility. Iris cornered me in the servants' dining hall one evening, her freckled face creased with worry. "Sarah, people are talking. They're saying you've caught the king's attention." She lowered her voice. "They're saying you've been alone with him, that he speaks to you, that he—" She broke off, biting her lip. "That he what?" I asked, though I already knew. "That he's shown you favor, and with the vote coming up, with tensions so high about Omega rights." She gripped my hand. "Please be careful. There are people here who would use you to hurt him, or hurt you to send him a message." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that there was nothing between the king and me except the professional relationship between monarch and servant. But I would have been lying. In the 2 weeks since that morning when I'd knelt beside his chair, something had grown between us, fragile and unspoken, but undeniably real. He'd started asking me to stay longer in the mornings, not for any particular task, but simply to be present while he worked. Sometimes we talked, carefully neutral conversations about books or the weather or the gardens outside his windows. Other times we existed in comfortable silence, him at his desk reviewing documents, me organizing his chambers or mending a torn curtain, or simply sitting by the fire with a book he'd offered me from his personal collection. It was in those quiet moments that I learned who he really was beneath the crown. I learned that he loved poetry but pretended not to, that he had a weakness for honey cakes from the kitchen but rarely indulged, that he carried the weight of every decision like stones in his pockets. I learned that his mate had died in childbirth along with their daughter, and that he blamed himself for not being there, for being away at war when they needed him most. And he learned about me too, or the parts of me I could remember. I told him about waking in that alley, about the merchant who'd helped me, about the small kindnesses that had kept me alive when survival seemed impossible. I didn't tell him about the nightmares that still woke me, about the phantom pains in my ribs, about the terror that sometimes seized me when men got too close. Some scars were still too fresh to share. 3 days before the gathering, everything came to a head. I arrived at his chambers to find the door already open and voices raised inside. I hesitated, but Madame Corvin's training overrode my caution. I had a schedule to keep, tasks to complete. I slipped inside quietly, hoping to be invisible. Lord Garrett stood in the center of the room, his face flushed with anger, gesturing wildly. 2 other alphas flanked him, Lord Rowan of the Eastern Territories, a stocky man with cold eyes, and Lady Celeste of the Western Reaches, beautiful and sharp as a blade. "You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment, Declan," Garrett was saying. "The Omega laws exist for a reason. Structure, order, protection." Protection? The king's voice was dangerously quiet. I froze near the fireplace, trying to be invisible. You mean control, ownership. Call it what you will, Lady Celeste interjected smoothly. But the old ways kept peace. Since their abolishment, we've had nothing but chaos, omegas wandering without pack structure, taking jobs meant for betas, disrupting the natural hierarchy. The natural hierarchy, Declan repeated, and I heard the rage simmering beneath his controlled tone. Tell me, Celeste, in this natural hierarchy of yours, where do orphans fall? Where do those without pack or family claim their place? They don't, Lord Rowan said bluntly. That's the point. Omegas need pack structure to thrive. Giving them independence was a mistake, one we have the opportunity to correct. I remained frozen, my hands clutching the water pitcher so tightly my knuckles had gone white. They were talking about people like me, about taking away the tiny scraps of freedom and dignity we'd managed to claim. And if I refuse to support the vote? Declan asked. Then you'll be remembered as the king who let sentiment destroy what his predecessors built, Garrett said. The territories will fracture, alphas will lose faith in your leadership. And when that happens... He smiled, cold and calculating. Well, there are other ways to ensure proper governance. The threat hung in the air like poison. Get out! The king's voice cut like a blade. All of you. Now! They left, but not before Garrett's eyes found me standing by the fireplace. His smile widened, predatory and knowing. Perhaps your judgment is already more clouded than we thought, he said softly, then departed with the others. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud. The silence that followed felt suffocating. I set down the water pitcher with shaking hands and turned to leave, but Declan's voice stopped me. Stay. Please. He stood by the window, his back to me, shoulders rigid with tension. Dawn light illuminated his profile, highlighting the exhaustion etched into his features. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world, and perhaps he was. I'm sorry you had to hear that, he said quietly. I'm sorry they're forcing you to choose between your conscience and your crown. He turned to face me then, something raw in his expression. There shouldn't be a choice. A king who abandons his people's welfare isn't a king worth following. Then don't abandon us, I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. Fight for us. We're worth fighting for. I know you are. He crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him. Sarah, I need to tell you something. About why I've let you stay, He stopped, struggling with words. That first morning, when you woke me from the nightmare, when you touched my shoulder and told me I was safe, I was awake. My breath caught. What? I'd been awake for several minutes watching you work. I wanted to see what kind of person you were when you thought no one was watching. His eyes held mine, intense and honest, and then I pretended to have a nightmare, to test you. To see if you'd follow your orders to remain invisible, or if you'd choose compassion over obedience. I should have felt angry, manipulated, but instead, I understood. A king couldn't afford to trust easily. Everyone wanted something from him: power, favor, influence. Everyone except perhaps a nobody Omega with nothing to gain. Why are you telling me this? I whispered. Because I've continued the test, he admitted. Every morning, watching how you move through my space with respect, but not fear. How you organize my chaos without judgment. How you see the man beneath the crown, and don't flinch from what you find. He reached up slowly, giving me time to pull away, and cupped my face in his hands. And what I've learned, Sarah, is that you're the most genuine person in this entire palace. Maybe in my entire kingdom. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might break through my ribs. Your Majesty. Declan, he interrupted softly. When we're alone, call me Declan. Declan, I breathed, and felt him shiver at the sound of his name on my lips. This is dangerous. If they suspect that you care about me, they'll use it against you. Against the vote. Against everything you're trying to protect. I know. His thumb traced my cheekbone with devastating gentleness, but I can't seem to stop. You've become the best part of my days, Sarah. The only real thing in a world of politics and manipulation. I closed my eyes, leaning into his touch despite every warning voice in my head. I'm nobody. I have no pack, no name, no memory of who I was before. I can't help you politically. I can't give you anything except yourself, he finished. And that's everything. He leaned down slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to remind him of propriety and protocol, and the 1,000 reasons why a king and a servant could never be anything more. But I didn't pull away. Instead, I rose on my toes and met him halfway. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent. A question rather than a demand. His lips were warm against mine, tasting of morning tea and possibility. When he pulled back, his eyes searched my face with an intensity that stole my breath. I'm going to fight for you, he said quietly. For all the Omegas in this kingdom. I'll find a way to stop this vote, even if it costs me everything. Not everything, I whispered, my hand finding his. Not yourself. Promise me you won't sacrifice who you are, even for this. Even for me. He pulled me close, wrapping his arms around me like I was something precious. I fit against him perfectly, my head tucked beneath his chin. And for a moment, the world outside his chambers didn't exist. There was no vote, no threat, no danger. Just two people who'd found unexpected comfort in each other's presence, but moments like that never last. A sharp knock at the door made us spring apart. I smoothed my uniform while Declan straightened his shirt, both of us trying to erase the evidence of what had just happened. Enter, he called, his voice steady. A messenger burst in, breathless and pale. Your Majesty, there's been an incident. A group of Omegas from the city were attacked last night. 3 were taken, and the others are demanding audience with you. They're gathering at the palace gates, the blood drained from Declan's face. Taken? By whom? They're claiming it was alphas from the Northern Territories, Your Majesty, acting under the assumption that the old laws would soon be reinstated. The messenger hesitated. Lord Garrett's men, specifically. The temperature in the room plummeted. I watched Declan's expression shift from shock to cold fury, the kind of rage that moved mountains and toppled kingdoms. Assemble the full council, he said, his voice like iron. Every territorial alpha, every advisor, every noble with a seat. We convene in 1 hour. His eyes found mine, and in them I saw both apology and determination. And send word to the city Omegas. Tell them their king hears them. Tell them justice will be served. The messenger fled to carry out his orders. Declan turned to me, his hand reaching for mine one more time. This changes everything, he said softly. They've given me the leverage I need. They've shown their hand too soon, revealed their cruelty before the vote could legitimize it. His grip tightened. But it's going to get dangerous, Sarah. Stay close to the palace. Don't go into the city alone. And if anyone threatens you, I'll scream loud enough to wake the dead. I promised, trying to inject levity into the moment. He didn't smile. Instead, he pulled me close and pressed his lips to my forehead, a gesture that felt like both blessing and goodbye. Go, he said, before someone sees us, before I lose my resolve to let you leave. I went, my heart heavy with foreboding. As I descended the stairs, I could already hear the commotion in the palace. Raised voices, running feet, the metallic sound of weapons being readied. The summer gathering hadn't even begun, and already blood had been spilled. And somehow, I knew this was only the beginning. The Great Hall had never felt so oppressive. I watched from the servants' gallery, a narrow balcony hidden behind ornate screens where staff could observe council proceedings without being seen. Below, the territorial alphas sat in a semicircle facing the throne, their postures ranging from defensive to openly hostile. Lord Garrett lounged in his seat with calculated ease, but I could see the tension in his jaw. Beside him, Lord Rowan and Lady Celeste exchanged whispered words, their expressions carefully neutral. Declan sat on the throne like judgment itself, perfectly still, his face carved from stone, his eyes coldest gray I'd ever seen them. The crown on his head caught the light from the massive chandeliers, throwing shadows across his features that made him look ancient and terrifying. 3 omegas, he said, his voice carrying through the cavernous space with terrible clarity, taken from their homes in the night, beaten, bound, transported to the northern territories under the assumption that they were property to be claimed. He paused, letting the words sink in, and this happened within my kingdom, under my protection, while representatives of that same northern territory sat in my palace drinking my wine and demanding I sanction such behavior. A misunderstanding, Garrett said smoothly, but sweat beaded at his temples. Overzealous guards acting on outdated information. I've already ordered their return. Their return? Declan's voice dropped to something more dangerous than a shout, as if they were borrowed books, misplaced property. He stood, and even from my hidden vantage point, I felt the power rolling off him in waves. They are citizens of this kingdom. They have names, families, lives that your men disrupted with violence, and you dare call it a misunderstanding? Lord Rowan cleared his throat. Your Majesty, while the incident is regrettable, it highlights the very problem we've been discussing. Without clear pack structure, without the old laws to define boundaries and ownership, confusion is inevitable. Ownership. The king descended from his throne, moving with predatory grace toward the assembled alphas. That word again. Tell me, Rowan, do you own your betas, your gammas, or do they serve by choice, bound by loyalty rather than chains? That's different. How? Declan stopped directly in front of him. Explain to me how an Omega's freedom threatens your power more than a Beta's. Explain why one designation deserves autonomy while another deserves bondage. Silence filled the hall. I held my breath, watching the political dance unfold below. This was more than a debate about laws. This was about the soul of the kingdom, about what kind of future they would build. Lady Celeste stood gracefully, her silk dress rustling. Your Majesty, perhaps we're approaching this from the wrong angle. No one here wants to see Omegas suffer, but we must consider stability. The old laws provided structure, protection. Protection from what? A new voice rang out, and I gasped softly as a woman strode into the hall uninvited, flanked by a dozen other Omegas. She was tall for an Omega, with dark skin and eyes that blazed with righteous fury. Protection from living our own lives? From choosing our own paths? Guards moved to intercept her, but Declan held up his hand. Let her speak. Let them all speak. The woman, I would later learn her name was Maya, approached the center of the hall without fear. I am Maya Thornfield, and I run a bakery in the merchant district. I employ 3 betas and 2 other omegas. I pay taxes to this kingdom and contribute to its prosperity. Under the old laws, I would be property. My business would belong to whatever alpha claimed me. My employees would lose their livelihoods. She turned to face the assembled alphas. You speak of protection, but what you mean is control. You speak of structure, but what you mean is oppression. Other Omegas stepped forward, each sharing their stories. A teacher who educated beta and alpha children alike, a healer who ran a clinic serving the poorest districts, a merchant who'd built trade relationships across all 5 territories. Each one a living refutation of the idea that Omegas needed to be owned to be safe. I watched Declan's face as they spoke, saw the way his expression softened with pride and pain. He'd known some of these people, had approved grants for Maya's bakery expansion, had funded the clinic, had personally thanked the teacher for her service. These weren't abstract concepts or political pawns. They were his people, and he was seeing them truly, perhaps for the first time. When the last Omega finished speaking, the silence felt sacred. Then Lord Garrett laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that shattered the moment. Very touching. But the fact remains that 3 territories support reinstatement. Your little parade of success stories doesn't change the vote, Declan. In 2 days, when the gathering convenes officially, we will call for restoration of the old laws, and we will win. No, Declan said quietly. You won't. Garrett's smile faltered. The math is simple. 3 territories to your 2 was simple. Declan interrupted. Before you revealed your hand too early, before you showed everyone here exactly what those old laws would mean in practice. He turned to address the full council. Lord Garrett has given us a gift. a clear demonstration of the cruelty and chaos that would follow reinstatement. He's shown us that the moment he believed those laws would pass, his men acted with violence and impunity. Imagine what they would do once it became legal. He was magnificent in that moment. Not just a king, but a leader worth following. I felt my chest swell with pride and fear in equal measure. Lady Celeste stood again, her expression troubled. "Your Majesty, while I find Garrett's methods distasteful, the concerns about stability remain. Then let's discuss real solutions," Declan said firmly. "Not ownership masquerading as protection, but genuine support structures. Pack affiliations that are chosen, not forced. Legal protections for Omegas who wish to remain independent. Economic programs to ensure all citizens, regardless of designation, have opportunities to thrive." He paused. "These are the conversations we should be having. These are the laws we should be crafting." I could see the shift happening, subtle, but real. Lord Rowan's expression had moved from defensive to thoughtful. Lady Celeste was nodding slowly, her sharp mind clearly working through the implications. Even some of Garrett's own advisors were exchanging uncertain glances. But Garrett himself had gone still and cold, his eyes calculating. When he spoke, his voice was deceptively soft. "You've thought this through carefully, haven't you, Declan? This passionate defense of Omega rights. One might wonder what inspired such devotion." His gaze swept the room, landing on the servants' gallery where I stood hidden. Or perhaps, who inspired it? My blood turned to ice. "Careful, Garrett." Declan's voice carried a warning that made several alphas flinch. "Oh, I'm being very careful," Garrett continued, standing now. "I'm carefully observing that our king, who has shown no interest in personal attachment since his mate's death, has suddenly become quite invested in Omega welfare. I'm carefully noting that he's replaced his longtime attendant with a pretty little blonde Omega, who now spends hours alone in his private chambers. I'm carefully wondering if personal sentiment is clouding royal judgment. The implications hung in the air like knives. If Garrett could prove that Declan's stance was motivated by personal attachment rather than political principle, he could undermine everything. "My judgment is sound," Declan said coldly, "and my personal life is none of your concern." "Isn't it?" Garrett pressed. "You're asking us to overturn tradition, to reshape our entire social structure. Don't we have the right to know if you're acting as a king or as a man besotted with his servant?" The word besotted echoed through the hall, followed by whispers. I pressed myself against the wall, wishing I could disappear entirely. Maya stepped forward again, her voice cutting through the speculation. "The king's personal life is irrelevant. What matters is that he's right. The old laws are cruel and unnecessary. We've proven we can contribute to society without being owned. That should be evidence enough." But I could see the damage was done. Seeds of doubt had been planted. Some of the previously swaying alphas were reconsidering, their expressions closing off. Political calculation was replacing moral clarity. Declan saw it too, his hands clenched at his sides. And for a moment, I thought he might do something rash, proclaim his feelings publicly. Damn the consequences. But he was a king first, and kings had to think beyond their own desires. "This council is adjourned," he announced, his voice brooking no argument. "We reconvene tomorrow morning. I suggest you all spend the evening considering whether you want to be remembered as leaders who protected their people or tyrants who enslaved them. Choose wisely." The alphas filed out slowly, talking among themselves in hushed tones. Garrett left last, throwing one final calculating look toward the servants' gallery. He couldn't see me through the screens, but somehow I felt exposed anyway. When the hall finally emptied, I made my way down through the servants' passages, my mind racing. I needed to leave. My presence was endangering everything Declan was trying to accomplish. If I disappeared, if I removed myself from the equation, Garrett would lose his ammunition. But I'd barely made it to my quarters when Iris intercepted me, her face pale with fear. "Sarah, thank the gods. Madame Corvin is looking for you. She's furious. Something about inappropriate conduct and dismissal." My heart sank. Of course. Garrett must have worked quickly, applying pressure through official channels. If I was dismissed, sent away in disgrace, it would serve as proof that something inappropriate had occurred. "Where is she?" I asked. "Her office. But Sarah..." Iris grabbed my arm. Don't go. Pack your things and leave now. I'll help you. There are merchant caravans heading south in the morning. You could disappear before— No. The word came out harder than I intended. I won't run. I won't give them that satisfaction. I walked to Madame Corvin's office with my head high and my hands steady, even though my heart was breaking. The door was partially open, and I could hear voices inside, Madame Corvin's clipped tones and a deeper voice that made my steps falter. Declan. Will not allow you to dismiss her based on baseless rumors, he was saying, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Your Majesty, I am merely trying to protect the palace's reputation. If there is any hint of impropriety— There is no impropriety. Sarah has performed her duties admirably. You will reinstate her to her regular position in the East Wing, effective immediately. But, Your Majesty— That is an order, Madame Corvin, not a request. Silence fell. I stood frozen in the hallway, torn between gratitude and despair. He was protecting me, but at what cost? Every time he defended me, he proved Garrett's accusations true. I knocked softly on the doorframe. Both of them turned to face me, and the relief in Declan's eyes nearly undid me. Sarah, Madame Corvin said stiffly, you've been reassigned to the East Wing, as per His Majesty's orders. Report there tomorrow morning. Yes, madam. I curtsied, keeping my eyes down. That will be all? She dismissed me, clearly eager to end the uncomfortable situation. But Declan stopped me with a word. Sarah, wait outside. I need to speak with you. Madame Corvin's lips thinned, but she said nothing. I stepped into the hallway and waited, my heart pounding. When Declan emerged a few minutes later, he looked exhausted, the weight of the day finally showing in the slump of his shoulders. Walk with me, he said quietly. We walked through the dimly lit corridors, maintaining a careful distance between us, but I could feel the tension humming in the air. He led me to a small courtyard garden, empty at this hour, lit only by torches and moonlight. I'm sorry, we both said simultaneously, then stopped. You have nothing to apologize for, Declan said firmly. Garrett is a manipulative bastard using whatever weapons he can find. You're not a weapon. You're a person. And I won't let him treat you as anything less. But he's right, I whispered, tears burning behind my eyes. Your judgment is clouded by me, because of me. And now the vote is in jeopardy, and those Omegas who spoke so bravely might lose everything because I— He closed the distance between us, his hands gentle on my shoulders. Listen to me. My judgment is clearer than it's ever been. You didn't cloud my vision, Sarah. You cleared it. You made me see what I'd been too blind to notice, that the people I'm meant to protect are more than statistics in reports. They're individuals with dreams and courage and incredible strength. His thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped down my cheek. You did that. And I won't apologize for it, and I won't let you believe it was wrong. Then what do we do? I asked helplessly. How do we win when they're using our feelings as ammunition? We do what we've always done, he said softly. We fight. We stand for what's right, regardless of the cost. And we trust that truth is stronger than manipulation. He was so close, and I wanted nothing more than to lean into him, to let him hold me and pretend that the world outside this garden didn't exist. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not while so much hung in the balance. The gathering opens tomorrow, I said. Whatever happens, he interrupted. I want you to know something. You've given me more in these few weeks than I've had in years. Hope. Purpose. A reason to believe that leading this kingdom means something beyond maintaining power. His hand cupped my face, his eyes intense. Whatever happens tomorrow, that doesn't change. I rose on my toes and kissed him. Brief and sweet, a moment stolen from fate. When I pulled back, I saw the same fear and determination in his eyes that I felt in my heart. Win, I whispered. Not for me, for Maya and all the others who deserve to live free. I will, he promised. But as I walked back to the servants' quarters alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest battle was still ahead, and that victory, if it came at all, would cost us more than either of us imagined. The summer gathering opened with all the pageantry and tradition of centuries past. The great hall had been transformed. Banners from every territory hung from the vaulted ceiling, and the ancient stone walls were lined with torches that cast dancing shadows across the assembled crowd. Alphas, betas, and even a few brave omegas filled the space, all waiting to see how this historic vote would unfold. I watched from my old position in the servants' gallery, no longer assigned to the king's chambers but unable to stay away. Below, Declan sat on his throne in full royal regalia, crown, ceremonial robes, the ancient sword of the kingdom resting across his lap. He looked every inch the powerful monarch, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped once against the throne's armrest before stilling. The morning had been chaos. Maya and her group of Omegas had been granted official recognition as witnesses, allowed to stand in a designated section near the front. Lord Garrett and his supporters occupied the opposite side, their expressions ranging from smug confidence to barely concealed hostility. The middle ground, the undecided alphas whose votes would determine everything, sat in careful neutrality, their faces revealing nothing. The High Chancellor, an ancient beta named Werner who'd served 3 kings before Declan, struck his staff against the stone floor 3 times. The sound echoed through the hall like a heartbeat, and silence fell. "The summer gathering is called to order," Werner announced, his voice surprisingly strong for someone so aged. "We convene to address the proposal brought forth by the Northern, Eastern, and Western territories. The reinstatement of Historical Statute 47, commonly known as the Omega Protection Laws." Protection. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. Lord Garrett stood, his golden hair gleaming in the torchlight. He'd dressed for the occasion in expensive finery that spoke of wealth and power. Honored council members, territorial representatives, citizens of our great kingdom, we gather today to correct a mistake made by previous generations. The abolishment of the Omega Protection Laws has led to decades of chaos and confusion. Omegas wandering without pack structure, vulnerable to exploitation, lacking the guidance and security that only proper alpha leadership can provide. He was good, I had to admit. His voice carried sympathy and concern, as if he truly cared about Omega welfare, as if his men hadn't kidnapped 3 people just days ago. "We have seen the consequences of this failed experiment," Garrett continued, warming to his theme. "Omegas living in poverty without pack support, crimes against Omegas increasing because they lack proper protection, social disorder as traditional hierarchies break down." He paused for effect. "The old laws weren't about oppression. They were about ensuring every Omega had a place, a protector, a purpose." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I could see some heads nodding, people swayed by his rhetoric. My stomach churned. Maya stood then, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "May I respond to these claims, Your Majesty?" Declan nodded. "The floor recognizes Maya Thornfield." "Lord Garrett speaks of protection," Maya said, her voice steady and clear. "But 3 nights ago, his men demonstrated exactly what that protection looks like. They broke into homes. They beat people. They dragged 3 Omegas away in chains." She turned to face Garrett directly. "That is the protection you offer? That is the security you promise?" Garrett's expression hardened. "Those were rogue actors, as I've explained. They will be punished. But their misguided actions don't invalidate the principle that Omegas are property," Maya interrupted. "That we exist only in relation to the alphas who claim us? I built my bakery with my own hands. I feed 24 families through the employment I provide. Under your laws, all of that would belong to whatever alpha decided I needed his protection." She practically spat the last word. "Order!" Werner called as voices rose throughout the hall. "We will have order." Lord Rowan stood next, his expression thoughtful. "The lady makes valid points. Perhaps the issue is not whether Omegas need protection, but rather what form that protection should take." His Majesty mentioned alternative structures, voluntary pack affiliations, legal safeguards. Perhaps we should explore those options before reverting to historical precedent. I felt a flutter of hope. Rowan had been firmly in Garrett's camp before. His wavering now could shift the entire balance. But Garrett wasn't finished. "With respect, Lord Rowan, these alternative structures are untested and complicated. Why reinvent the wheel when we have centuries of tradition to guide us? He turned to face the throne directly. Unless, of course, there are personal reasons influencing His Majesty's position, reasons that might compromise objective judgment. The temperature in the hall dropped. Every eye turned to Declan, waiting for his response. The king stood slowly, and the power radiating from him made several people step back. "You dare," he said softly, but his voice carried to every corner of the hall. "You dare question my judgment? You, who sent your men to commit violence before the vote even occurred? You, who treat citizens of this kingdom as commodities to be claimed? I question whether personal attachment to a particular Omega might be clouding your vision," Garrett said, meeting Declan's glare without flinching. "I question whether a king who spends his mornings alone with a servant girl can truly claim objectivity on matters of Omega law." Gasps echoed through the hall. I pressed myself against the wall of the gallery, wishing I could disappear. "My personal life," Declan said, his voice like ice, "is exactly that, personal. But since you've made it a matter of public debate, let me be perfectly clear." He descended from the throne, moving to stand in the center of the hall where everyone could see him. "Yes, I have spent time with Sarah. Yes, I value her presence and her perspective. And do you know what I've learned from her, Garrett?" He didn't wait for an answer. "I've learned that an Omega with no pack, no family, no advantages of any kind can still possess more courage, compassion, and integrity than most nobles I've encountered. I've learned that treating people as fully realized individuals rather than categories to be managed actually strengthens a kingdom rather than weakening it. I've learned that my previous blindness to the struggles of Omegas was a failure of leadership, not a failure of policy." The hall was utterly silent now, everyone hanging on his words. "So yes," Declan continued, "my position on this vote is personal, because good governance should be personal. Because laws should be crafted with real people in mind, not abstract principles of hierarchy and control, because a king who can't see his people as individuals isn't fit to rule." He turned in a slow circle, addressing the entire assembly. "Every person in this hall, Alpha, Beta, Omega, has value beyond their designation, has dreams and goals and the right to pursue them without being owned. If you cannot see that, if you truly believe that reinstating laws that legalize ownership and strip away autonomy is the answer, then you are not voting for protection. You are voting for oppression. And history will judge you accordingly." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then Lady Celeste stood, her silk dress rustling in the quiet. "Your Majesty speaks with passion," she said carefully. "And perhaps with more wisdom than I initially credited. I move to table the proposal for reinstatement, and instead form a committee to explore alternative protection structures, voluntary pack affiliations, legal frameworks, economic support systems, solutions that protect without enslaving." "Seconded," Lord Rowan said immediately. Garrett's face had gone purple with rage. "This is absurd. We have 3 territories in support." "You had 3 territories," Lady Celeste corrected coldly, "before you revealed your true intentions. Before your men demonstrated exactly what reinstatement would mean. I will not be party to legalized violence, Lord Garrett. My vote has changed." The flutter of hope in my chest became a roar. If Celeste and Rowan had switched sides, the vote would fail. The old laws would remain abolished. Omegas would remain free. "Then we call for the vote," Werner announced. "All in favor of tabling the reinstatement proposal and forming an alternative solutions committee?" Hands rose throughout the hall, not just from the territorial alphas, but from betas and omegas in the audience, from nobles and common citizens alike. A clear majority. "All opposed?" Garrett's hand rose, along with a handful of his most loyal supporters from the Northern Territories. But they were a clear minority, outnumbered by those who'd chosen freedom over control. "The motion passes," Werner declared, striking his staff against the floor 3 times. "Historical Statute 47 will remain abolished. A committee will be formed to develop comprehensive alternative structures, with full input from Omega representatives." The hall erupted in cheers and applause. I watched Maya embrace the Omegas around her, tears streaming down her face. I watched Lord Rowan shake Declan's hand with genuine respect. I watched Lady Celeste nod to the king with something like approval. And I watched Garrett storm from the hall, his expression promising that this defeat would not be forgotten. But in that moment, victory felt absolute. The celebrations continued throughout the day and into the evening. A feast was held in the great hall, with nobles and commoners mingling in unprecedented fashion. I kept to the servants' areas, helping serve food and wine, content to observe from the edges. But as the moon rose and the festivities began to wind down, a guard approached me. "Miss Sarah, His Majesty requests your presence in the rose garden." My heart leaped into my throat. I followed the guard through quiet corridors to the palace's most beautiful garden, a walled sanctuary filled with roses of every color, their fragrance heavy in the night air. Lanterns hung from the trees, casting soft golden light across the paths. Declan stood at the garden's center, near a fountain where water splashed over ancient stone. He'd removed his crown and ceremonial robes, wearing simple, elegant clothes that made him look less like a king and more like a man. "You came," he said softly as I approached. "You summoned me, Your Majesty." "Declan," he corrected gently. "Remember?" I smiled despite my nervousness. "Declan." He closed the distance between us, his hands finding mine. "We did it. We actually did it." "You did it," I corrected. "That speech, you moved people, changed minds, protected thousands of Omegas you'll never even meet." "I had good reason to," he said, his thumb tracing circles on my palm. "A certain stubborn Omega taught me that compassion isn't weakness, that seeing people as individuals rather than categories is strength, not sentimentality. I didn't teach you anything you didn't already know," I whispered. "I just reminded you." "Then let me remind you of something," he said, his voice dropping lower. "That morning when you woke me from a nightmare that wasn't real, when you chose kindness over obedience. You changed my life, Sarah. You made me want to be the king this kingdom deserves. You made me believe that maybe, despite everything I've lost, I could still find something worth fighting for." Tears blurred my vision. "Declan, I love you," he said simply, the words falling between us like stones into still water, creating ripples that would change everything. "I know it's complicated. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this is difficult, but I love you, Sarah. And I need you to know that before anything else happens." My breath caught in my chest. "I love you too," I whispered. "I think I have since that first morning. When I saw you as more than a king, when I saw you as just you." He pulled me close, wrapping his arms around me, and I felt something settle in my chest. A sense of belonging I'd been searching for since waking in that alley with no memory of home. This was home. Not a place, but a person. Not safety from the world, but safety to be myself within it. "What happens now?" I asked against his chest. "Now?" He pulled back just enough to see my face, his expression soft with hope. "Now we build something new, not just laws and committees, but us. Together." He hesitated. "If you want that. I know I'm asking for something complicated. Being with me means public scrutiny, political complications, danger from people like Garrett who will never forgive today's defeat. I spent years invisible," I said firmly. "Living small, hiding, surviving but not truly living. You've shown me what it means to be seen, to matter, to fight for something beyond survival." I cupped his face in my hands. "So yes, I want complicated. I want difficult. I want everything, as long as it's with you." He kissed me then, not the gentle, questioning kiss from before, but something deeper, a promise and a claiming and a celebration all at once. When we finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. "I'm going to court you properly," he said. "Public declarations, formal ceremonies, the whole traditional process. I want everyone to know that you're not my servant or my secret. You're the woman I love, and I intend to make you my queen." "Queen?" I laughed, the sound shaky with disbelief. "Declan, I'm nobody. I have no pack, no family name, no memory of—" "You're Sarah," he interrupted firmly. "The woman who taught a king how to be human again. The woman who stood up for others even when she had nothing. The woman who chose compassion when cruelty would have been easier. His eyes held mine with absolute certainty. That's more than enough. That's everything. In the distance, I could hear the fading sounds of celebration. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, Garrett's wounded pride, political maneuvering, the hard work of building those alternative structures. There would be obstacles and opposition, and moments of doubt. But tonight, in a garden filled with roses and moonlight, with the man I loved holding me like I was precious, I felt something I'd never expected to feel again. Hope. Not just for survival, but for a future worth building. Tell me about your nightmares, I said softly. The real ones. Let me help carry them. He stiffened slightly, then relaxed. They're about my mate, my daughter. Arriving too late, finding them already gone, his voice roughened with old pain. I dreamed that if I'd been faster, stronger, better, they'd still be alive. And my nightmares are about whatever I can't remember, I confessed. About waking up in that alley again and again, never knowing what I lost or who I was before. And then we'll face them together, he said. Your nightmares and mine, your past and mine, all of it. We stayed in the garden until the moon reached its peak, talking about everything and nothing, dreams and fears, hopes and plans, making promises we intended to keep. 3 months later, I stood in the great hall wearing a gown of midnight blue, my pale blonde hair woven with flowers, as the High Chancellor performed the bonding ceremony. Maya stood as my witness, tears streaming down her face. Lord Rowan and Lady Celeste attended as honored guests. Their earlier opposition transformed into genuine support, and Declan stood before me in royal regalia, his eyes full of love and wonder, as he spoke the ancient vows that would bind us not just as mates, but as partners in leading the kingdom. When he placed the crown on my head, lighter than his but no less significant, I felt the weight of responsibility and possibility in equal measure. Queen Sarah, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. My queen, my love, my home, my king, I whispered back, my partner, my heart. The kingdom that had once seen me as invisible, that had written laws to keep people like me powerless, now had an Omega Queen. And together, Declan and I would ensure that no one, regardless of designation or circumstance, would ever be made to feel invisible again. The summer gathering had changed more than laws. It had changed hearts and minds. It had proven that compassion was stronger than tradition, that love could reshape kingdoms, that even the smallest voice could echo through history if someone powerful enough chose to listen. And sometimes, the greatest strength comes not from those who rule, but from those who remind rulers why they should. I'd come to the palace as nobody, a servant with no past and no future. But I was leaving my old life behind to step into something greater. Not because of a crown or a title, but because I'd learned that being seen, being valued, being loved for who you truly are, that is the truest form of power. And that power, once claimed, can never be taken away.